You're listening to Live at Lord North Street, a podcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. This week, our Head of Education, Dr. Steve Davies, and News Editor Kate Andrews discuss how farming technology is revolutionising our world. Although current discussions tend to focus on AI, automation and robotics, recent developments in farming tech offer solutions to demographic crises, allowing us to feed an ever-growing population without compromising on economic development or environmental concerns. The pair also discuss some of the ongoing debates within the environmentalist movement over these varying technologies.
Steve, so much of the focus on technology is on robots and automation and this idea of the unknown through that kind of AI intelligence. But there are all other kinds of techs that are coming onto the market and also going off of the market. Should we be thinking about these too?
Oh, very much so. It is not understandable that at the moment the main focus is on the likely impact of artificial intelligence and the impact that robotisation is going to have on the world of work. But in fact, there are other technologies out there which are likely to change the world in equally, if not even more dramatic ways. One of them, for example, is a whole range of new technologies associated with one of the oldest of human activities, and that is agriculture. Now, we forget just how significant and important agriculture is because these days it only employs about 1.5% of the total working population. But in terms of the amount of resources that it takes up, the impact that it has upon the environment and the part it plays in our lives, it's actually by far the most important activity that human beings are engaged in. If you're an environmentalist, then agriculture is actually your main enemy. People tend to think that it's industry and manufacturing that has a very big negative effect upon the environment. But in fact, it's farming and agriculture that is responsible for the bulk of things like habitat destruction, species loss, and many other things that people are quite rightly concerned about. Now, there's a whole number of new technologies appearing in this area. One of them, for example, is the practice of cultivating meat, growing meat, not in the shape of an actual live animal that you feed, but rather in a laboratory or in some kind of mass production culture factory. The first ever man-made hamburger was actually consumed here in London a few years ago. It was the work of a number of Dutch scientists, which was then consumed at a state ceremony, you might say, here in London.
Maybe one day there'll be a statue right on this very spot.
I think there might well be. I personally believe that within another 20 to 30 years, it will be regarded as very strange, perhaps even barbaric and backwards, to eat meat that has come from a living animal. But we won't have all become vegetarians. We will still be eating meat. It's just that the meat will be cultured and grown in vats rather than being got from animals. And it's worth thinking about what the implications of this actually are, quite apart from the fact that it will be enormously beneficial in terms of animal well-being, because you'll no longer have to have large numbers of animals kept in very cruel conditions, particularly animals like pigs or cattle, for example. It'll also have an enormous environmental impact. Currently, almost half of all the grain that is grown in the world is fed to livestock. This is an unbelievably inefficient way of producing food in terms of energy, land use, a whole number of other factors. So all of that could be done away with, and the mathematics tells you straightforwardly this means that at a stroke, almost half of the land currently used for growing grain will be freed up for other uses. We can also, of course, produce meat with different kinds of flavours, different kind of qualities, and do this without investing enormous amounts of energy, land, space, and the environment in doing it. The other technology, which is often mentioned, is what's known as vertical farming. This is where instead of growing crops like root vegetables or fruits in the ground, you grow them rather in hydroponic medium, that's to say in a liquid nutrient medium, and you do this in large vertical buildings where you essentially have a floor of a building which will be a whole series of hydroponic tanks in which, say, lettuce or fruit plants or tomatoes are being grown. You'll have these floors stacked one on top of the other to a considerable height. The plants will be grown partly in natural sunlight, partly under arc lamps of one kind or other to provide artificial sunlight equivalent. Now, what this means is a number of things. First of all, it means that you can actually grow a crop of, like, say, a root vegetable or a fruit 3 or 4 times a year, maybe even as often as 6 times a year, rather than just having at most 2. So at a stroke, you've enormously increased the yield and production of these kinds of food. Moreover, you can control the conditions under which the plants grow far more effectively. You have far less need, in fact almost no need, to protect against pests through the use of herbicides and pesticides. So again, the environmental impact is enormously reduced. And it means, therefore, that you're going to, again, free up an enormous amount of land, which is currently used for growing food of this kind, and replace it with this kind of much more urbanized, localized cultivation through hydroponic agriculture. Not only that, you're going to enormously reduce the amount of distance that food has to be shipped, because these vertical farms will mainly be located in large metropolitan areas, very close to the end consumers of the food, and you therefore won't need to do what you do at the moment, which is to ship vegetables, fruit and other kinds of products very, very long distances around the planet to get them from where they're produced to where they're going to be actually eaten. So that again will have an enormously beneficial environmental impact. It's worth saying that there's been enormous development in this area in the last few years, a lot of which is actually driven by the illegal enterprise of cultivating cannabis. So, yes, I mean, there are many, many people now growing cannabis plants.
It's not illegal everywhere now. You've got
Indeed,
a
I know.
few places in the States.
So, yes, as I say, there are lots and lots of cannabis growers growing cannabis in hydroponic media or in pots underneath arc lamps all around North America and Europe. And they've made a lot of technological innovations, which, of course, they can't patent. Because you can't exactly go to the patent office and demand a patent for growing an illegal product. It'll be interesting to see what happens now that increasingly it is becoming legalized.
It sounds to me like, from the environmentalist perspective, this is all a dream. A lot of the critiques about meat eaters at the moment, not just from the vegetarian perspective of the ethics of eating animals, but also from the environmental impact perspective, is that your carbon footprint is so much bigger. If you even cut out, they say, meat 1 day a week, you can really reduce your carbon footprint. But if we are able to grow meat in petri dishes, and if we are able to free up a lot of the land that's used for hosting animals, this could have very beneficial environmental impact.
Yes, absolutely. As you rightly say, the way we currently produce food has an enormous environmental impact in terms of things like carbon footprint, greenhouse gases being produced, use of increasingly scarce resources like water, degradation of land quality due to over-intensive farming and stripping out of nutrients from the soil, a whole load of really bad things actually, and very damaging processes. As I mentioned earlier, also widespread habitat destruction and consequent species loss, where natural habitats like tropical rainforest or savanna are cut down or ploughed up and turned into monoculture farming. All of this could be removed with these breakthroughs in agricultural science and technology. And this would mean that our impact as a species on the biosphere would be dramatically reduced. In addition, I think the major effect, if you're an environmentalist, would be that this would free up a colossal amount of land. And this land would then be free not just for other human uses, like building, for example, but more importantly, I think the bulk of it could be returned to wild habitat. You could re-wild very large parts of the planet, in which large areas of land could be allowed to revert to their natural condition as grassland, for example, tropical rainforest, temperate forest, and the like. And we could then reintroduce species that are currently exist only in relict form, or which have become extremely rare, to very large parts of their former range. So on the American Great Plains and the prairies, for example, you might well have large parts of it turned back over to buffalo and coyote, and you might indeed see the recreation of the kind of landscape that the first American pioneers confronted when they arrived there in the mid-19th century.
Is that how you would suggest we use the land? I was going to ask, if you have all of this land that's no longer being used for agricultural purposes, you could see many different groups and parties and philosophies competing for what to do with it.
Indeed, and of course the interesting question is, how do you decide what to do with it? Yeah. Now, I would, not surprisingly, recommend that we simply use market forces and decide who has a particular idea for that land, and if they're prepared to put their money where their mouth is, then we will find out that the land will revert to the use that's most desired by most people. I suspect that actually a lot of it will be used for the rewilding that I describe, partly because a lot of the land is not going to be useful for other purposes, and also because I think there are enough people out there with enough resources at their disposal who would like to see this, that they will effectively come out on top in terms of what you might call the auction process by which we'll reallocate this particular resource. Of course, some land land will be used for development. Some land will be turned into, say, resorts or housing or other human uses. But there's so much land that we're talking about here that I suspect a lot of it will, in fact, revert to wilderness, and probably in a highly managed way. But I would use market forces and the competitive bidding for resources to decide how we allocate it. I don't think we should go down the route of planning it.
Always looking for areas of consensus. Is this somewhere that environmentalists and free marketeers, who aren't always on the same side of the debate, could come together?
Well, it could be. I think actually what this kind of development will do is reveal divisions within the environmental movement and also perhaps within the free market movement, but more I think on the environmental side. Some environmentalists, like Paul Kingsnorth, for example, the founder of the Dark Mountain Project, are absolutely horrified at the kind of ideas I'm talking about, because they see it as a move away from a truly natural world to a human-controlled and managed world. They think it's a loss of true wildness, a true natural environment. On the other hand, other kinds of environmentalists are very supportive of these kind of ideas and very much welcome it as a way of reducing the human impact on the biosphere and reviving the genetic and biological diversity of the planet. So I think there's a division there on the environmental side between two different ideas or visions of what environmentalism actually is. And there's one side represented, for example, by Stuart Brand, the man who founded the Whole Earth catalogue back in the 1970s, who favour the use of high technology. They see it as environmentally beneficial. People like Mark Linus are other examples, another example of that. On the other hand, people like Paul Kingsnorth represent a different kind of environmentalism, one which actually sees a lot of human ingenuity and human behaviour as being in some sense unnatural or threatening to the natural world. Clearly, that's not the view that I share. So I think that what's going to happen is perhaps an emergence of different divisions and different alliances, where some environmentalists, organisations like the Sierra Club, for example, in the United States, will be much more sympathetic to this kind of programme. Others, the more radical or fundamentalist Greens, if you will, people like Bill McKibben, the aforementioned Paul Kingsnorth, will be very much opposed to it. So we'll see big ructions, I think, within the environmental side about this.
I would think that if you are concerned both about human welfare and also about animal welfare, and perhaps not all environmentalists actually are, but if you are concerned about animal welfare, this idea of always supporting the natural still requires us to potentially, take the lives of animals in less ethical ways, this and that.
Well, the problem is, if you take this very fundamentalist environmental view, which I've described, the kind of Bill McKibben, Paul Kingsnorth position, the boat has already sailed in some ways as far as they're concerned, because once the population of human beings on the planet has gone above a pretty low level, as a species we have such an impact on the world that inevitably a concern for things like animal welfare or conservation is going to lead us to have to take active steps, for example, to manage animal populations by culling or something like that. And so I think that the kind of vision that the radicals have is one that's only really compatible with an extremely small human population. Once the human population has gone above a few 100 million, I suspect, you simply aren't in a position to follow that line anymore. So I think that's a kind of poetic but ultimately unrealistic view of the world. And I think the more practical view of the world is the one that organisations like the Sierra Club or, for example, PETA take. So PETA, the Society for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, of course, they have put significant amounts of money into researching the artificial cultivation of meat, because from their point of view, this is a complete win, because it's enormously beneficial for their main issue, which is animal welfare.
From an international perspective, if we were to be developing these kinds of technologies at a rapid pace in certain areas of the world, could this have a negative impact on developing countries, which are now becoming more and more reliant on shipping their agricultural goods to other parts of the world to make money?
In the short term, it might indeed have an effect on, say, for example, the cultivation of cut flowers in Kenya, which is a major export for that part of Africa. In the longer run, though, and in fact this might be even not that long a run, it's going to be beneficial for them, simply because it will free up an enormous amount of labour and resources currently devoted to agriculture and primary manufacturing, and enable it to move into other sectors of the economy, including ones that are more highly value-added, which will therefore lead to higher incomes for those people. So you might have some short-term dislocation, as you do with any kind of economic change, but I think that in the medium term this is actually going to benefit societies like, say, India or rural China or large parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
Steve, thanks so much.
If you like what you've heard, head to our website, iea.org.uk, for more information, reports, blogs and podcasts from our team.